I want to begin by reading you a little section from a book that was written by Anna Louise Strong, an American activist and journalist who visited Central Asia in the early 1920s. And she wrote a book very much in the genre of excitement on the part of some American leftists, seeing the Soviet Union as a great prospect for a new model of statehood. And the book was called The First Time in History. I'm going to read a bit from the chapter on education in Soviet Russia, as it's called. And it reads as follows. Some delegates of the Uzbek nation came to Moscow. We want a teachers' institute, they said. It's a prosaic demand, but it covers the wildest romance of education that perhaps the world has ever seen. You have never heard of the Uzbeks, neither have I. Neither has anyone except a few anthropologists who study the half-wild tribes between Europe and Asia. Some 8 or 10 of these people, doubtless sons of privileged chieftains, once penetrated far enough into the world to learn Russian and receive higher education. It isn't surprising that you and I missed those 8 or 10. In the days of the Tsar, the Uzbeks had not discovered the alphabet. It follows that they had no textbooks. No one, since the world began, ever learned to read or write in Uzbek. But then came the Russian Revolution. Well, she's very excited, and she's very enthusiastic, obviously, about the revolution. She's a bit misinformed about Central Asia and the Uzbeks. In fact, the Uzbeks did have writing, in fact, before the Russians did, perhaps. I mean, it's hard to define when the Uzbeks began writing, but because the Uzbeks have a complicated history. But it's certainly not the case that civilization was brought to Central Asia by the Russians, though that is one of the narratives that has dominated the 20th century in particular, and some of the, of course, the enthusiasm for the Soviet project that we saw in the 20th century as well. Now, I'm asked to talk to you about the reemergence of Central Asia and the Caucasus as a field of study in a region that Americans focus on. Of course, that's probably referring primarily to what has happened since the breakup of the Soviet Union. It was possible to ask your average American what they know about Uzbekistan, and they'll say absolutely nothing. It still is probably possible to ask many Americans the same question and get the same answer, but the situation has changed quite a bit, and Uzbekistan is taught as a subject in elementary schools, in social studies classes and so on. So the world has changed, but it's not the first time that Central Asia has emerged as a region that has caught the world's attention. And I will take you to a few of those previous moments in history. And in talking about those moments, I want to talk about the way that the interest in this region has governed the way that we think about it and what kinds of issues arise and the frameworks for analysis that have affected the way that the region is understood, often in not very helpful ways, I think, in terms of trying to understand what the region is all about. And a good example of that is this quote that I gave you from Anna Louise Strong, who clearly had an agenda in trying to paint the Central Asians as very backward and distant from civilization and in desperate need of modernization. This kind of assessment of Central Asia has been characteristic, particularly since the Russian advance into the region, so preceding Soviet rule in the region, and has served as in many parts of the world where colonialism has come about as a rationale for the so-called spread of civilization into the region brought by European powers. So that is but one of the agendas that I'll be talking about today. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Okay, before I do that, I want to present to you the geography. I know that probably most of you are not primarily focused on this part of the world, don't have the map etched on your brains like I do, and to situate the region in terms of the frameworks that we think about it as well. First of all, here you have a map of Eurasia, or at least part of Eurasia. It's chopping off the western part of Eurasia, at least by one definition. This is what Eurasia meant to me when I was going to school. It was Europe and Asia together, two big continents, or really just one landmass. It has, of course, through history had a variety of different meanings, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But if we want to talk about Central Asia, so the region that I'm Central Asia and the Caucasus and such places, the regions that I'm going to focus on primarily today, of course, where the center is of a big continent is a bit hard to define as well. And the term Central Asia has been applied to different parts of this region in the last century or so. Many British authors consider Central Asia to be primarily Mongolia and Western China, so a region much further east than what I'll be talking about primarily today. It's come to have a settled meaning focused on the 5 stands, so I'll have a closer map in a moment of that, but the western part of what is sometimes called Inner Asia also. And so 5 former Soviet republics. But of course, this is a rather arbitrary definition in many ways, because the peoples that inhabit these regions spread across the borders, and I'll show you a picture of that as well. The fact that this part was part of the Soviet Union was an artifact of Russian colonial expansion into the region. And of course, it's had a huge impact on the way that the world is understood today, both within and outside of the region. But at the same time, Western China, for example, Xinjiang region, northern Afghanistan, Azerbaijan is divided between Iran and the former Soviet Republic, and so on. These are all places where there's it's quite arbitrary where the borders are drawn. And sorry. Okay. Yeah. So just zooming in a bit here. Actually, I'll move on to the next map for interest of time. Okay, so to begin with some terms, we have in the title of this Summer Institute, we have the term Eurasia, and as I noted, it has a variety of different meanings, which have been changing rapidly over the past couple decades as well. As I noted, the first definition that I encountered was just the combination of 2 land masses, or one land mass, Europe and Asia together. But there's also an old meaning of Eurasia that goes back to in Russian history, Russian thinking, that situates Eurasia as a kind of a counterposition in relation to Europe. So it's the part of Europe that's really more Asian than Europe is I suppose one way to think about this, and the part of the landmass that connects with eastern places. And that connects with another concept which has become quite popular in the post-Soviet period, particularly in places like Kazakhstan, where there's a notion of a region which brings together both Europe and Asia. So it's not fully European, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to follow a European model. But at the same time, it opens doors to Asia for Europe and things like that. And Kazakhstan itself is officially bridging between, geographically bridging because the western part is in what is officially known as Europe, being west of the Ural River. And so this idea of something that's not fully European, and it's okay that that's not, but also opens doors to Asia and connects with places further east, that's something that's become quite common. And these are all things that figure into the current imaginations of the region as well. That is how Central Asians want to think of themselves as connected with other parts of the world. There's, of course, another definition of Eurasia which has become quite common, and that's basically a euphemism for the former Soviet Union. We don't want to use a negative category like the former Soviet Union, so we say Eurasia instead. But of course, it has the same semantic impact ultimately, because we're failing to define something in any other way besides the fact that it's the former Soviet Union in that context. And another way that this figures, for example, in the center where I work, the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard, the Eurasia, of course, is the rest of the former Soviet Union. So everything besides Russia, and it particularly tends to be thought of as the southern parts, so Central Asia and the Caucasus, the parts that I'll be talking about primarily today. But again, this is sort of a negative definition of taking out Russia out of the framework of concepts. And then yet another idea that is used as a way of appealing to a new kind of unity across the region and a rationale for building links that connect, for example, the Muslim regions of the former Soviet Union, not with Islam, but rather with something that really is the former Soviet Union, but a rationale for, in a sense, reintegrating that space that fell apart in 1991-92. There are other terms that relate to the region that I'll be talking about today, and these are very dynamically moving terms, terms that it's often hard to pin down on maps. The primary one being Central Asia, and Central Asia has been drawn very broadly, sometimes very narrowly. When I first established the program on Central Asia at Harvard, I just called it Central Asia and meant everything from the Crimea to Mongolia, sort of a very broad definition. But the problem with that, of course, is that some of these people don't want to be called Central Asians. For example, in the Caucasus, they don't think of themselves as being Central Asia, although, for example, one of the major journals in this field, Central Asian Survey, has always considered the Caucasus to be just as much part of its territory as other parts. So there's a sort of an ambivalent relationship to the term Central Asia. In the Russian-speaking context prior to 1991, there were two terms which you could encounter. One, Srednya Asia, sometimes translated, I think, rather oddly into English as Middle Asia. And that is, what in the Russian context, it was usually referred to as Central Asia and Kazakhstan. So basically, it's the 5 republics that we now tend to call Central Asia, plus but separating Kazakhstan out of Central Asia. And there's some ambivalence about whether Kazakhstan properly belongs in that context. But interestingly, after 1991, especially in Kazakhstan itself, but throughout the region, there's been a desire to reconceptualize things and to draw things more broadly. And the term Centralnaya Asia, which in Russian context used to mean not this area that is not the stans, the western part of Central Asia at all, but rather Mongolia and places like that, the Gobi Desert being the center of Central Asia. But in the post-Soviet period, there's been a desire to reconceptualize, and this has led to a concept, this term Centralnaya Asia, which includes sometimes not just the 5 former Soviet republics, but also Afghanistan in some contexts, as well as Western China. And of course, the way that it's defined in my talk today is Central Asia and the Caucasus, which tends to narrow the definition of Central Asia to not include the Caucasus, of course, and perhaps not to include other places as well. But I will be talking about things that connect beyond these boundaries to some extent. So, for example, the other Muslim regions of Russia, which are neither Central Asia or the Caucasus by this definition, the Caucasus being what is otherwise known as the Southern Caucasus, the North Caucasus now being a part of Russia. And then yet another term, Eurasia, which was put forward by Dennis Seinor. I'll talk a little bit more about him later, which takes in everything which, he was Hungarian, and he was very interested in the unity of things Finnic and Ugric and Turkic and Mongolian, considered that this was all one family. In fact, probably he believed that the Koreans and Japanese were part of the same family as well. So this great, huge territory extending all the way from Finland and Hungary to Manchuria, and perhaps also Korea and Japan, was unified into a concept that actually created the Eurasian and Altaic Studies Department at Indiana as part of its legacy, since renamed the Department of Central Eurasian Studies. And that leads me to the last term on the list here, Central Eurasia, which when it first appeared right around 1991 was when it really started making an impact. I didn't like it. It seemed like just another euphemism for the rump Soviet Union, basically. But then I was elected president of the Central Eurasian Studies Society, and the idea started to grow on me. I mean, it was a new society at the time, and I thought this is not the right name for it. But actually, it works quite well, and I would encourage everyone to consider this as a good way to designate the region, because it has the advantage of being ill-defined, first of all, and therefore you can define it. You can create terms for defining it, and the Caucasians, people from the Caucasus, are very keen to go to the Central Eurasian Studies Society conference, but they wouldn't have gone to a Central Asian Studies conference, for example. So it goes to show how emotions also play into the way that people think about these concepts. And I don't want to spend too much more time on this map. Why are we not seeing a map here? Okay, so here we have the very sharply colored map of Central Asia and the Caucasus countries. So there's 5 Central Asian states. This being what used to be called Srednya Asia, the southern part, and then Kazakhstan was added in. Now all this tends to be referred to as Centralna Asia, plus the Caucasus. So 3 southern Caucasus republics south of the Caucasus mountain range here. And of course, what that does is cuts off the North Caucasus, which in many ways is very closely connected with that region. And it cuts off other things, which I'll show you on other map in a moment. But of course, one of the ways that we tend to think about this region is not so much about geography, but about who the people are that live there. And this is one way to cut or to describe them, that is to think about their religious affiliation. And indeed, this has been one of the dominant frameworks for thinking about this part of the world since Soviet times. That is, to think about it as the Muslim part of the former Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union at the time. And what you have on this map is the density, or the percentage of population who are Muslims according to the last, or one of the last Soviet census, the second to last Soviet census. And the darker colors are very dense Muslim populations, whereas, I mean, this is a little bit less, and then as you go further north towards the Arctic Circle, you get small percentages of the population. Of course, doesn't mean there's a lot of Muslims up in the Arctic Circle. They're just part of the same administrative unit that this map is marking out. But there actually are quite a few Muslims in the Arctic Circle now because of labor migration, and this began already during Soviet times. I have friends in northern Tajikistan who, throughout the late Soviet period and into the present, have been going off to 2 men to pump oil in shifts of weeks at a time. And another place on this map that should be marked is Moscow itself, because of course there's a huge Muslim population in Moscow and in other cities there was in Soviet times, and there is now as well. Of course, this way of thinking about things divides the Caucasus. So you have the Christian Caucasus and the Muslim Caucasus, Azerbaijan and the northern Caucasus being predominantly Muslim populations, especially in the eastern part, Georgia and Armenia being Christian, even more so now than they were during Soviet times because of the flights of population between republics. Now, this map shows a different way of thinking about the world, and I'm not sure, actually, I don't really quite understand what they're trying to do with this map, but it gives an example of how people have tried to reconceptualize Central Asia's position within the wider world. Here we have a map that connects Kenya and Kazakhstan. Not something that the people in Kazakhstan would probably be that keen to do. I mean, they don't see themselves as belonging to that same part of the world. But I think it reflects also this way of thinking about the world as being vulnerable to Islam, actually. I mean, that's what this map is about, is the way that Islam can extend from fundamentalist states in Sudan and other parts of the Islamic world and connect and pose a certain kind of danger for Central Asia as well. Well, the fact that it's not gray means that they're trying to focus on this region, but the rest of the colors are just, I think, the map maker's choice of a good pattern. But taking us back to the Soviet context, of course, this is the Soviet Union, and what you see here is I mean, what comes out clearly on this map is that there are certain areas where it's not Russia. So starting with Kazakhstan, which actually looks a lot like Russia for some reason on the coloring of the map. But this northern boundary of Kazakhstan, maybe because there's so many Russians, other Europeans here. But so these areas end up being a region unto themselves in this as the world appears on this framework. And let me focus in a bit on that. So you have these the Central Asian republics, but beyond the southern Caucasus, which I pointed out before, you have a number of small territories you see marked out here, which are also Muslim inhabited predominantly, or at least formerly. Many of them have now been overrun by migrants from other parts of Russia. And here's the map of republics as it stood at the end of the Soviet time. If we look at the world now, though, in the Caucasus region, the actual control of Armenia extends well into the territory of Azerbaijan, for example. So this map doesn't quite show the real picture. And of course, Russia has now basically annexed or come close to annexing southern Ossetia and Abkhazia. So the map is changing in some ways. Most countries don't recognize those changes, but the facts on the ground certainly speak to dramatic change that's going on in the region. But the situation in the Caucasus is extremely complicated linguistically and in terms of the distribution of populations. And you can get a bit of a sense of that from this map here. The greenish colors represent Turkic population. So along the Caspian coast and extending down to Iran. Of course, this part of Iran is predominantly Turkic population as well, also called Azerbaijan. Then you have the Armenians, and these bluish colors are various Iranian groups, which include the Ossetians, which extend from the northern Caucasus in Russia into that territory that I pointed out a moment ago in Georgia. And then various Caucasian groups, which speak very difficult to learn languages. And one of the things that makes the study of this part of the world really difficult is the fact that there's such a huge diversity of different languages spoken. Many of them are very difficult to learn. In fact, probably most of them are. And very few people learn more than a couple of them. So where I can claim to be a specialist on Central Asia in a broad sense, I've learned Tajik, so an Iranian language family member. I've learned Turkic, so that takes me to the rest of Central Asia. But people who can make that kind of claim about the Caucasus are very few, and they're linguists. It really complicates it, and it changes the picture for the study of the region as well, because it means that mostly the people who study Armenia, for example, are people who are really focused on Armenia and are not interested in Azerbaijan except as their enemy. And they're not that keen on the Georgians either, although they're Christians as well, Orthodox Christians. But there's lots of tensions between those two countries as well. And as a result, you have specialists who really focus on one or another part of the region, and very few people who can address it in a broad way. I'm myself starting to work more in Georgia, but the prospect of actually learning Georgian language is very daunting. Don't know if I'll ever actually manage to do that. This map shows, this is a ethnic map made by the CIA. They made some wonderfully colorful maps right at the end of the Soviet period. And one thing that you can see from this map, I mean, you can see the southern Soviet boundary here running across the map here, and then up that way. But one thing that you see is that the population groups in these areas extend across the boundaries in ways that make the boundaries not really very meaningful in terms of dividing or uniting ethnic populations. So there's more Tajiks in Afghanistan, actually, than there are in Tajikistan. There's a very large number of Uzbeks, this green color, Uzbeks in Afghanistan. And as I noted before, Azeri in Iranian Azerbaijan well outnumber the Azerbaijanis in Azerbaijan. So the boundaries are rather artificial in those terms, but of course the world has changed dramatically since those boundaries were established. That is the southern boundary, as I'll show you in a map in a moment, was the result of the Russian expansion into the region. But the 20th century and Soviet experience so dramatically transformed this region that people in Tajikistan, although they know that there's more Tajiks in Afghanistan than there are in Tajikistan, they don't think those are the same people at all. They think of them as very different. And now what I want to do is just talk about the transformation that this region has undergone in recent times. Of course, the world has not always been like it is now, with this region really being under Russia's wing. If you look at this map, you see Western Tatary, for example, in the center of the map. I don't know if that is very legible. The yellow at the top of the map is Russia. Actually, I think I have a better version of this map in a moment. But sorry. But if you try to put these two maps together, of course, it's very difficult. There's virtually no boundaries. That map shows the situation at the beginning of the 19th century, the end of the 20th century. There's virtually no boundaries that are in common. So as the states have emerged, in their current forms, of course, that has led to all kinds of transformations. So this claim that the Uzbeks didn't have an alphabet, I suppose you could actually almost make that claim to some extent if you focus on certain Uzbeks. If you trace Uzbek history back in a certain way, then you might be able to find those Uzbeks that didn't have an alphabet. But there was no common entity that logically became Uzbekistan as of 1924 when Uzbekistan was established. It was something that had to be created at that time and has been in the process of creation ever since. So creating an Uzbek identity really was something quite new as of 1925 when Anna Louise Strong was writing her comment on that. Why is this not? Okay, so yes. So here's that map in its fuller extent. And one thing I'd just like to note about this map is that though the map represents the situation after Russian expansion into the region, it's not really conceptualized as the same thing as Russia. You have European Russia, which is not colored on this map, and then the Asian parts of Russia are colored in these various colors. And interestingly, Western Tatary, which had just become part of Russia, at least parts of it had become part of Russia at the time of the making of this map, is colored all in red, although there's actually quite a diversity of territories here. This is Western China, of today's Western China. These are the still then independent states of Bukhara and Khiva.
Can you take us through a little bit? It's hard to read here. What some of the labelings are?
Whether the labels are?
Not
Okay.
all of them, but just the important
Sure. So Western Tatary reads here. You can see just the beginning of the word Tatary, which is from Eastern Tatary for the eastern part of this map. That large word up there, I wish I had a longer arm, is Orenburg. So that's the southern Russian outpost from where expansion into Central Asia was taking place. This is Turkmenia, which actually is one of the few terms that you would find on a map from this time, and also into contemporary time now called Turkmenistan, of course. But it wasn't a state at that time. It was just a territory where the Turkmen
The phrase used in the 20s and 30s for Trans-Caucasus.
Yeah, that's actually used right up till today by some people. And that refers to the other side of the Caucasus Mountains, trans being the beyond, right? And there's also something called Cis-Caucasus, very seldom used, which refers to the northern Caucasus. And this is all, of course, from the perspective of Russia. Whenever you have a term trans, it's in relation to somebody's point of reference.
Who made that map?
I actually have forgotten, but I can dig it out. Yeah, it's a British map.
What does that mean, government?
Yeah, this is the translation of gubernia in Russian, which is one of the most of the Russia was divided into gubernia as territories within Russia. But Central Asia at this time was not formally incorporated into Russia. It was still a military territory, and and only towards the end of the 19th century began to become incorporated. Any other questions? the map it represents the situation in the first half of the 19th century. I think it was made in the second half of the 19th century, but it was meant as a historical map. And here you have a map which shows the expansion of Russia into Central Asia. I won't show you the map of Russian expansion into the Caucasus, which happened basically just before the events that are represented on this map. And as you can see, starting at the end of the 18th century, so the dates at the top of the map are 18th century dates, or the middle of the 18th century, Russia began expanding into the steppe region and gained a loose control over what's now Kazakhstan through basically agreements with the Kazakh leaders, with what came to be under Soviet rule called the free-willing incorporation of the Kazakhs into the Russian state. This was the formulaic term. But of course, those Kazakhs didn't really mean that they were going to be part of the Soviet Union eventually. That was not their plan. It was just a way of getting the Russians off their back. And it didn't really mean much because this was very loosely controlled territory by anyone, very sparsely populated and so on. But as Russia gained more consolidated control over the Caucasus, they began focusing more on Central Asia. And by the mid part of the 19th century, so dates like 1864, you have expansion into the more densely populated regions of southern Central Asia, places like Tashkent, captured in 1865, Kokand, which was the center of one of the major khanates of the region in 1876, Samarkand and Bukhara within the Bukharan Emirate, and so on. And so, as I'll note a bit later, this was a time when Russia was starting to get quite close to British territories in the southern part of Asia. And we have this period of time has come to be called the Great Game, the period of supposed competition within the region between these two expanding imperial powers. And the last dates on this map are the very end of the 19th century when Russia and Britain were making deals and they sent joint expeditions up to these very remote Pamir regions, for example, where they made agreements about where the boundaries would fall in territories which were very remote from their control, actually, but they made these decisions. Ultimately, they decided that Russia should not have a common boundary with Britain, and so they made the Wakhan corridor, which extends, it's the eastern bit of Afghanistan, which extends between the bulk of Afghanistan and China. So this was all a part of the imperial process of expansion into the region. And this map shows the, sorry. Okay, good. This shows how it was gradually incorporated within the Russian state. So here you have Guvernat. This is actually, it was called in Russian Turkestansky Krai. So the Russian the Turkestan territory. There were various other krais around the edges of the Russian Empire, and they were incorporated on a somewhat different basis from most of the administrative structure of the Russian Empire itself. But at this time, you also had the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva here, which retained independence right up until the revolution, though they were heavily dominated by Russia and with, for example, trade agreements which required them to do trade with Russia, not with places to the south and so on. But Russia had very limited capacity in this region at this time, and right up until the early 20th century, there were limited numbers of Russians in the southern part of Central Asia. And I think Russia felt very far away at the time. Let me move over that quickly, just in the interest of time. Okay, so these are 19th century maps, and you see here the situation again, a map which shows European Russia as being distinct from the Asian part of Russia. You have Asian Russia here marked in yellow. And interestingly, they don't mark Khiva and Bukhara as being independent states. So the fact that they were independent really didn't mean too much to the European map makers at that time. And of course, the whole process of conceptualizing what kind of space this is, it was one that developed gradually. I have a wonderful map of this region, which represents the region in medieval times, and there are big areas that are just marked terra incognita. They admitted that they didn't know what was going on. Let's see. The mouse is daunting me here. Okay, and then in 1924, you have the creation of the republics more or less as they are today. That is, there was a process that extended from 1924 until the end of the 1930s, during which basically all the Soviet Socialist republics of, say, for example, Kyrgyzstan, or Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic, Uzbek, etc., they were established. And the process by which they were established was an interesting one. I already showed you how complicated the ethnic map of the region is, and indeed it's very complicated, and yet they were trying to represent the ethnic distribution in some way. They decided that they would base this division on national characteristics as they were defined at the time. Of course, most of the people didn't know what nation they belonged to. There wasn't a concept of a nation that matched up with what Stalin and the policymakers in Moscow wanted to create. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics based on. And as a result, you got very interesting things like the creation of Uzbekistan, where a very large part of the Uzbek population were people at that time who would have said, I'm not Uzbek. Those people are Uzbeks. We're not Uzbek at all. And it's only been gradually that people have come to accept the designations which were given. And that's further complicated by the fact that their distribution on the ground was quite mosaic-like. And in some way, this map it emphasizes what kind of a mosaic it was and how they seem to be trying to grab bits of population to include them in one or another republic. Yes?
Excuse me, but in all of this, was there anything equivalent to the partition between India and Pakistan, the mass movement of people?
Not in any way equivalent to that. And part of the reason is because, at the time of the partition in South Asia, everyone knew whether they were Muslim or non-Muslim, right? So they knew where they fit into this framework. But it was much more ambiguous when they created these republics. And there were many groups which actually could have gone either way at the time. And one good example of that is the Kipchaks, who inhabit a big part of what you see on this map. And they were eventually officially decided to be Uzbeks, but they speak a language which is rather close to Kyrgyz. And even to this day, Kipchaks would rather have their daughters marry Kyrgyz than Uzbeks because they're culturally closer. But they know that they're Uzbeks officially. So there's much more ambiguity. There were some movements of population, for example, in the case of the capital of Tajikistan, that's Dushanbe, which was a village of about 250 people at the time that it became the capital. They gave no city to the first version of Tajikistan, and as a result, they had to create a capital, and they invited a lot of Tajiks to come from other places like Samarkand, which fell in Uzbekistan, to come to form that new capital. So a very large part of the population of Dushanbe is actually Samarkandis and people from other cities, and they retain these identities, and they retain to some extent links with the places where they came from already nearly a century ago, or 80, 90 years ago. But one thing that I want to emphasize about this map is that though it's very crenulated, right, the boundaries seem to be grabbing bits of population, but they don't always do logical things like this bit. I mean, the red is Uzbekistan, right? But this bit is actually a Tajik Enclave. And they gave it to Uzbekistan for unknown reasons. It's actually very close to Tajikistan, so they could easily have connected it with Tajikistan. Then the next thing they did was, this is the 1930s version of the map. The next thing they did was actually take this territory, give it to Kyrgyzstan, create an island here. This is also an island. And so you have even more complicated boundaries than were established in this first version of the boundaries at the time. But the other thing to note about this is that the boundaries hardly mattered until 1991. They were internal boundaries within the Soviet Union, had some economic administrative significance, but for the most part, people really didn't even know where the boundaries were. And I did a lot of work in the Fergana Valley, actually, in the mid-1990s. So significantly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, people still didn't know where the boundaries were. They didn't know what republic they were, or what now independent country they were living in. Just after that, they started putting big fences and mines and things like that around the borders of Uzbekistan. So people started to know very well where the boundaries fell, and sometimes it just cut right in the middle of a house. These houses actually got to be useful monetary sources because you could sneak people through the boundary. So there were lots of ways to get across the boundaries beyond the very controlled efforts of the states tried to establish in the late 1990s. Yes?
Two questions. Wasn't Stalin a commissar for national minorities, and he maintained his interest? And two, wasn't there an interest in not drawing it along ethnic lines to dissipate nationalism?
Yeah, well, you're right that Stalin was the Commissar of Nationalities, and he's generally considered to be the author of the general Soviet idea of what nationalities should be and what role they should play in the construction of the Soviet Union. Although, in many ways, his ideas about nationalism were very standard, run-of-the-mill ideas. I mean, they were what was current at the time in general. But actually, just before this 1924 division, they had drawn up a completely different map that it made no reference to distributions of ethnic populations, and were going to do it along those, divide things along those lines. They decided eventually, and nobody's properly investigated why, that they would make this kind of division. About whether they were trying to dissipate or unite, there's actually quite a lot of interesting discourse about this, which fits into the Cold War discourses that I'll talk about a bit more later. But the gist of it is that there's a claim that this effort to mark out territories was actually a divide and rule strategy. That is, these people really just unified and didn't distinguish themselves in the way that the Soviet state encouraged them later to do. And by dividing things this way, it was a way of preventing predominantly Turkic unified Turkic population and Muslim population from standing as a significant counterweight to the Soviet project of development and transformation of the region. There's very little evidence to support that claim, that is, that it was a divide and rule strategy, but it certainly figures very strongly in the way that Westerners thought about this whole process of the transformation of Central Asia right up until the end of the Soviet Union. But I mean, of course, they're also uniting people and creating new identities which conceivably could become the basis of nationalism and the kind of thing that you were suggesting they would want to dissipate. Of course, at that time, there was nothing to dissipate. There wasn't any strong nationalism among Uzbeks, for example. So there was no danger of that at the time. But this tension that you've identified certainly plays importantly into the way that people think about the region throughout subsequent times. Now, I want to focus in again on the Fergana Valley region, which was what the previous map was presenting, and to put it in context. And this is a map made by a Hungarian explorer of the region at the end of actually I think it's the very first years of the 20th century, and his name is Oifalvi. And Hungarians were very interested in this part of the region, part of the world, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that they thought of these as their ethnic brothers, the Hungarians being together with the Turks in this broad Ural-Altaic linguistic family. And so various Hungarian explorers went off to Central Asia, including this guy, who made rather detailed ethnographic maps. And the Fergana Valley region, which I mentioned earlier, is this area here, so surrounded by the mountains which make up Kyrgyzstan. You can almost see Kyrgyzstan today. That is this big swath of yellow territory which surrounds the Fergana Valley. But one thing that's interesting here is that this red on the map is Tajik population, so Iranian speakers. And this is not Tajikistan in the resulting Tajikistan. That's actually a part of Uzbekistan. And there are various other anomalies that I could point out to you on the map. So the idea that this is the effort to map or to create a map that matched ethnic populations is actually quite I mean, it's quite tenuous in many ways. So, as I mentioned before, this whole area, the northern Fergana Valley, is marked as, it's probably exaggerated how many Tajiks there are there, but there's certainly very many Tajiks even today. That all became Uzbekistan. So let's move on. And then we have yet the same kind of issue appearing on maps that are made much more recently. That is the match between ethnic populations and different kinds of groups. This is a map that was made by the CIA also in 1990, so just on the eve of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And they were trying to identify to the Western policy audience where the problems would be in Central Asia. The things that they really focused in on were things like these anomalies of territory and population. So for example, let's see, some of these things will pop out. It's not working like it's supposed to. Okay, so I'll ignore the pop-outs. But so, for example, they focus on Bukhara and Samarkand, which are situated in Uzbekistan but have Tajik population. And this is understood to be a really big problem for the region, because how could Tajiks want to live within Uzbekistan? Well, it's actually not a problem at all, at least not like that. There's also for example, in the northern Tian Shan, they draw up this hot spot here of the interface between Kyrgyz and Kazakhs, and also a lot of Russian migrants to the region, with the idea that Russian migrants and Kyrgyz and Kazakhs will come into conflict. That's also not been an issue of conflict. So the way that the region has been conceptualized, and I think this is in part as a result of what actually happened in the Caucasus, where you did have very violent conflict that had an ethnic character to it. In Central Asia, these conflicts barely happened. There were few conflicts, and I don't want to minimize their importance, but nothing on the scale of what you had in the Caucasus, and yet that's the kind of problem of the way that people were thinking about the region. But as I noted before, until 1990, the boundaries existed, but people hardly paid attention to where they were and didn't have that much significance. Pop-outs are all coming up behind the map for some reason. Sorry. I have wonderful effects here that are simply not working. I usually try to plug my own computer into the... Is it just going into a loop here now?
This is from the CIA.
Yeah, they don't like what I'm saying about them. Okay. So now, just to give you one last sort of geographic presentation of the region, and to bring you, or to bring myself into the picture in a moment. This is you see the relief map of the Central Asian region, and on this map you can see it's really quite a large territory. See if my effects work here. Okay, so here's France, and so compared with France, it's really quite large. And just Kazakhstan is probably about 4 Frances. But the great majority of the population is concentrated in the southeastern part of Central Asia. The northern part, that what you see marked out here, is the steppe region. So it's a continuation of the great Eurasian steppe, which extends to Mongolia and to Hungary on the other end. Another reason why the Hungarians are so keen on Central Asia. And this is grassland and traditionally herding territory. Now, these two areas that I marked out are desert regions. They're very dry deserts where very little is possible to survive, and also herding regions, traditionally territories where you really had to move your herds quickly because they would exhaust the fodder very quickly and move between wells so that you could give them water. And then the third geographic type for Central Asia is this southeastern area of mountain regions, which include the Pamir and Alai regions here, as well as the Tian Shan, which are all extensions of major mountain systems that extend into China and the border of South Asia. And these are some of the highest mountains in the world, really very dramatic. I come from Colorado originally and thought I came from a mountainous territory, but not compared with these areas where I worked. Now, the circles that you see appearing on the map now show places that I've spent time doing field work. I'm an anthropologist, and I spend my time talking with people on the ground. So we'll take a break at 11, okay? And so showing some of the places that I've worked, and these represent some of the urban centers where I've worked. There's also, zooming in on the region where I've spent most of the time. So this is the southeastern part of Central Asia. These are all places where I've spent some significant amounts of time. I've spent altogether about 5 or 6 years in field work in Central Asia. And they include urban centers. Actually, Almaty, although it has a star now, is no longer the capital of Kazakhstan. They've moved it to Astana, further north in the country. But these are the concentrations of the most sort of intensive Sovietization of the region. You have other urban centers where I worked, including Samarkand and Osh here at the eastern end of the Fergana Valley, which, because they were not Republican capitals, were allowed to develop in a more sort of organic way, less heavily transformed by the Soviet project. And then I've worked in a lot of rural areas as well. The next pictures will show you just some of the landscapes of places where I've worked. This is actually my then one-year-old daughter. We were up doing field work on the border with China in Kyrgyzstan. And this is in the high mountains of Tajikistan, this spectacular area where there's actually no road into this area. At the very end of the Soviet period, they did one of their very last deportations of population, taking the entire population out of this region and forcing them to do agricultural work on the lowlands. And at the time when I visited, right around 1990, they were just being allowed to come back. Some people were coming back. So you have places like this also on the fringes of the mountain ranges. And indeed, most of the population is concentrated around the edges of the mountains or on the rivers which flow out of the mountains, which is, of course, where there's water to sustain life. This is in the northern edge of the Turkestan range, just on the western boundary of the Fergana Valley. And what you see here is they're growing rice, of all things. I mean, it's a very dry part of the world, but they love their rice, and in fact, they love local rice better than anything imported, so they still grow it. But most of the agriculture is concentrated on cotton production, and what you see here is a field that's been harvested of cotton, and now the sheep are eating the stubble. So there's a lot of sheep in Central Asia as well, but no sheep intimately doing field work there. And this view is looking northwards towards the Tian Shan Mountains. This picture is in Uzbekistan, but looking towards Kyrgyzstan and Fergana Valley. Then you have ancient urban capitals like Samarkand here. This picture I took at the end of the Soviet Union before they'd done a lot of the renovation work. Now they've completely rebuilt most of these monuments, so they look like they were built yesterday. And I think they've lost a lot of their character. And then this is also a late Soviet picture from Tashkent, what was represented urban modernization at the time. Of course, they have even much more urban modernized things now, lots of glass buildings in Tashkent trying to look very modern. Now, I wasn't the first person to visit Central Asia. And I wasn't one of those few anthropologists that Anna Louise Strong was referring to that knew that there were such things as Uzbeks. One of the early visitors, in fact, there have been a whole series of interesting travel logs that you can dig into from early visits, going back to Marco Polo and others, that visited this region. For what seemed like obvious reasons at the time, that this is the center of some of the biggest, most powerful states of the world. This what represents the embassy of Ruy González de Clavijo from Spain. So at the very beginning of the 15th century, he went off to visit Tamerlane's court, Timur, the court of Timur, who was then one of the greatest, the ruler over one of the largest empires of the world at the time. And he wrote an account which you can dig into. he visited Bukhara and Samarkand, of course, many other places along the way. He went through the southern Caucasus on the way, and he gives us an account of this. Actually, maybe this is a good moment to take a pause. I understand we'll take a break. So I will take you into more of these, the history of more of these people going into Central Asia and coming to know it when we resume. Well, after this visit in the early 15th century, of course, as I mentioned, there have been many other travelers to the region, and they've all been connected with ideas about why the region is important. I mean, one of the reasons why we hear about them is because they wrote about it and they were trying to sell their story. And so the question is, well, what kind of story about this region sells? What is important to a Western audience, and particularly an American audience, as we're thinking about it here? Of course, at this time, there was no American audience, but it's interestingly connected with America. This is just on the eve of the reconquest of southern Spain by the Christians, and then the emergence of Spain as a world power, and obviously the sending of an embassy to another world power at that time represents something about Spain's ambitions. And here you see the map of his journey. I won't pause on that. There were other moments in history when Central Asia drew attention, but probably most prominently the next moment would have been that period of the Great Game that I mentioned earlier, the period of Russian expansion southwards, which raised alarm in the British Empire about the potential for conflict over Asian territories, and the concern about the possibility of a common boundary and conflicts between the Russian Empire and the British Empire. And one of the most prominent figures writing about this matter was this gentleman, Charles Marvin, who wrote a number of very popular books in Britain. He's British, and this one is The Russian Advance Towards India. All of them had the character of sort of an alarmist message that we really need to worry about what these Russians are doing. I think that this conception of what the Russians were doing is somehow threatening Britain and British interests is probably rather exaggerated. Some people talk about reviving the concept of the Great Game as a framework for analyzing what's going on now in Central Asia. And I would even question whether it's actually a good idea to really focus on this Great Game as being the dominant dynamic of that period of time. One of the parts of that narrative is the notion that Russia needed to take Central Asian territories because of the Civil War in the United States and the problem that created for the cotton market and production of cotton material in Russia. Well, they weren't expanding cotton production in the Caucasus where they could have grown cotton. It doesn't seem very plausible that really is a major motivator for the Russian expansion into the region. And I'm not a specialist on this period, but those who do focus on this more have really called into question some of these rationales. But one of the key stories of the time, of course, and which connects with colonial expansion in other parts of the world, is the notion that Russia was expanding as a civilizing force and bringing civilization to these regions. What kind of civilization they were able to bring in the 19th century is a bit questionable, because the Russians weren't really ready or able to invest a great deal in this part of the world. And as I mentioned earlier, this part of the world really, I think, felt very remote from Russia. So those soldiers and other representatives of the empire that were based in Tashkent or Andijan felt very exposed, I think. And so when revolutionary times came in 1916-17, things very easily got out of hand in this region as well. Americans started becoming interested in this region as well, and one of the most prominent visitors to the region was a guy named Eugene Schuyler from upstate New York, and he produced a wonderful 2-volume work called Turkestan, Notes of a Journey in Russian Turkestan, etc. And And it's illustrated with these engravings, which are mainly actually drawn from artwork of Vasily Vereshchagin. Some of you may know his work. Vereshchagin was a Russian artist who traveled with the Russian armies into various places where they were fighting battles and expanding the empire and so on, and into Turkestan, among other places. And Schuyler was a diplomat, and he was stationed in Russia for a period of time, as well as in Turkey and other nearby places, and was very interested in this part of the world. He reinforced the idea that Russian expansion was a good thing, and along with, this is actually another painting by Vereshchagin, along with the Russian representations of the region, suggested that this is a very wild and unruly part of the world that really needs civilizing, and the Russian impact was a positive one on the region. That's what he was able to confirm to the world. Now, a bit later, the accounts that we get about Central Asia come from different groups of people, and I'll focus for a moment on people who originated from within the region and eventually made their way out of the region, mostly in connection with the revolution. This guy, Mustafa Chukayev, is from Kazakhstan, and Gulnar, who will be talking this afternoon, could tell you a lot more about him than I can, I'm sure. He was one of the leaders of opposition to the Bolsheviks, and for a short period in 1917 led an independent state of Turkestan, which eventually was crushed by the Red Army. And he fled to the west and wrote some works on Central Asia, which began a tradition of writing in the West by émigré scholars, which was very much, of course, critical of the Russian regime, especially the Soviet regime, and we have even before the beginning of the Cold War here the emergence of a very strongly polarized discourse about what's happening in Central Asia in relation to the kind of rule that it has and how that's perceived by Central Asians. So Chukayev was very critical of the Soviet regime, and in fact, in 1941, he participated in forming a Turkestan regiment. That's what this little badge is from, under the army of the Third Reich, which fought against Hitler's armies and incorporated both émigrés as well as captured soldiers in fighting against the Soviets during World War II. Another, probably more important figure from the point of view of scholarship is this gentleman, Zekivelidi Togan, who is originally from Bashkortostan, so that's up in central Russia, but one of the territories which under Soviet rule became an autonomous territory within Russia, alongside of Tatarstan. So it's right next to Tatarstan, and these two groups, the Bashkirs and the Tatars, are very closely related ethnically as well. And they had a traditional connection with Central Asia because they had been involved in the Russian imperial project and often were used as translators and spies and intelligence people in the Russian expansion into the region. They also had a strong cultural affinity, both on the basis of Islam and Turkic identity. And in the period prior to the revolution, there had been a growth of such movements as the Jadidist movement, that is a reform movement within Islam, which extended across this region all the way from Constantinople through Crimea and the Tatars, the Volga Basin and into Central Asia, with links and exchanges of newspapers and so on. Well, Togan was involved in that sort of thing, and then when the revolution came about, he also joined up against the Bolsheviks and was a key figure also in an effort to create an independent state in Turkestan in 1917, and he also eventually fled to the west. He lived in Europe for a while and eventually settled in Turkey. Here you see one of the books that he wrote in Turkish about Turkestan, and he became one of the major voices which presented Central Asia to the West. And he and others like him, I think, became the authors, really, of that idea that we talked about a bit earlier, the idea that Central Asia was meant to be united as a Turkestan, a unified territory of Turks and Muslims, and was unjustly divided into separate republics as a method of divide and rule, as I was talking about earlier. Zeki Validi Togan was very critical of the Soviet regime. On the other hand, you have figures like this woman, who I already quoted you from. This is Anna Louise Strong, whose text I began my presentation with. And she was a Seattle labor activist and leftist who became quite convinced of the value of the Soviet project. In the early 1920s, so in 21 through 23, she went off to Russia, Soviet Russia, and visited Central Asia as well, and wrote a number of books based on this, including this one that you see here, The Road to the Great Pamir, the Pamir being the mountain range in southeastern Tajikistan. She also wrote one called The Red Star over Samarkand. And these books are filled with her encounters in the region, which are almost uniformly enthusiastic. She felt like the Soviet regime was bringing great things to Central Asia and bringing about the civilization and progress in a model that she thought quite appealing. She eventually focused more on China and actually joined up with Chinese revolutionaries and died in 1970 in China, having lived out her days there. But I think she did actually become a bit more critical about how things were going in the Soviet territories as she grew older as well. But you see with these two discourses now, especially the emigre discourse and the discourse of enthusiastic Westerners who visit the region, a real bifurcation of perspectives on Central Asia, and really a great difficulty bringing them together. There are some frameworks in which they come together neatly. For example, the general approval of Soviet modernization, the idea that the spread of education, for example, the introduction of near universal education and also literacy, and also especially the project of emancipation of women, was something that Anna Louise Strong was extremely enthusiastic about, and also met approval in general, even by most critics of the Soviet Union in relation to Central Asia. Now, another interesting figure in this picture is Langston Hughes, who also made a visit to Central Asia. He had a deal with a Soviet publishing, or actually film studio, to make a film about race relations in the United States. And for reasons which I haven't seen well explained, that project fell through. I think that ultimately probably his vision didn't match with the Soviet vision in some ways. But he remained very enthusiastic about the Soviet Union, visited Central Asia. He stayed for a number of months in Soviet Union, especially Central Asia, and went to Central Asia with the expectation of finding, and he generally confirmed this, that there is a part of the world where dark people are treated like equals with other people, and that this is a great success of the Soviet project of egalitarianism. And you see him in the middle of the photo here with his turban on. He traveled around and wrote a small book about his visit to Central Asia, which was published in Moscow. I don't think there's someone who's trying to republish it here, but I don't think it's actually come out yet. It has in Bishkek. Oh, is that right? Oh, is that right? Okay, great. And these are actually, I should have enlarged some of these photos, but you see here a travel article that Langston Hughes wrote about Central Asia afterwards. So he was trying to sell newspaper articles talking about how women are now dancing in Uzbekistan, which they couldn't do previously. They're happy to do that together with men. He also, in the description of this, the accompanying article, it says that both men and women are able to watch this, but there's actually no women in the audience. I don't see any in the picture. And I'm actually a little suspicious that this is actually not an Uzbek woman, but perhaps a Russian. The person who created Uzbek dance is a woman who was called Tamara Khanum, was a Russian migrant to the region, and who invented Uzbek dance forms for the various parts of Uzbekistan as part of the project of creating a national culture for the region, something that Langston Hughes found very appealing, but many of us would tend to view more critically today. And it creates a bit of a problem interpreting what happens when Langston Hughes goes off to Central Asia. He's just not seeing what's going on there. Of course, thousands of people were being repressed in various forms just around the same time as they were completing the process of collectivization, and thousands of people dying in artificial famines and so on. He didn't write about this, obviously, in the book that was published in Moscow. And I haven't seen any writings of his that address this difficult contradiction of seeing something that he found very appealing, obviously, but at the same time something that raised difficult issues. The version of the book that I've seen is actually in the Yale Library with his notes on it. He edited the text, and it's interesting to look at the way that he wanted to change the story that was coming through in this officially Soviet-produced publication. But of course, the discourses that surround these visitors to Central Asia at that time were the kinds of transformations that were going on, including, at that time, of course, very weak movement towards industrialization and that sort of thing, but expansion of agricultural production and education and so on. And the role of women being one of the major themes that is addressed by many of the authors. Others include not only Langston Hughes and Louis Strong, but another is Fanina Halle, for example, from Germany or Switzerland, I think. And so the image is of one where it's a movement from this kind of situation for women where they have no public space at all. They're enclosed even in public. And what you see here is what's called the paranja. It's basically a defective coat. It's like a coat draped over her head with artificial arms that you couldn't put your sleeves into, and then your artificial sleeves that you couldn't put your arms into, and then a horsehair mesh that further covers her face. This is what the Soviet project saved Central Asian women from. The fact is that only a very small percentage of Central Asian women wore these outfits. Only the elite, the women of families which were trying to make a point of showing their wealth by showing how they could have their women isolated in this way. Most women had a much more public involvement. But of course, lots of different kinds of transformations, and Westerners were also enthusiastic about some of these. For example, the bicycle on the step and that sort of thing. And especially, of course, the introduction of education of women and girls. And this is indeed one of the huge successes, as many people view it, of the Soviet project. One that very few people in Central Asia would want to go back on now, even if they view other aspects of Soviet experience negatively. Now, the discourses about Central Asia and the Caucasus that emerged in Western writing, of course, it contained a lot of critical elements, and there are two threads of critical discourse that pertain particularly towards Central Asia. And in some ways, they're rather contradictory. They're very well represented by this figure, Alexander Bennigsen, and also his daughter, Maria Roxa Bennigsen, who wrote, you could say, the majority of the books that were, Bennigsen himself and his co-authors wrote the majority of books that were written about Central Asia by anyone during this time, practically, that is, during the latter part of the Soviet period. The discourses that I want to highlight are, on the one hand, the claim that the Soviet rule is very powerful and totalitarian and controlling, and has successfully eradicated lots of elements of traditional culture and the things that people value. So, for example, the discourse about Islam is that it was basically completely suppressed in most parts of the Soviet Union as a measure of the Soviet state's draconian atheistic policies. At the same time, there is a parallel discourse that emerges in these same writings, both by Bennigsen and many others writing about the Soviet Union, Central Asia during this period. And that is that there is a very strong impulse of traditionalism in the region which resists Sovietization. And so Bennigsen himself talks about how dramatically suppressed Islam is, but also how Islam is really seething under the surface and it poses a real danger of bursting forth as a threat to the stability of the Soviet Union. And not only Bennigsen but others, the few people that actually talked about scenarios for the breakup of the Soviet Union tended to talk about the Muslims as being the problem. It turned out that that's not really what happened. The Muslims were not the least, or were not the most restive members of the Soviet population. On the contrary. But that discourse of traditionalism and opposition to Soviet rule it emerges very strong. And this, of course, underlies the kinds of things that we were talking about earlier, the notion of divide and rule, the question of whether the Soviet state was allowing the nationalities to develop themselves by the creation of national republics and promotion of national cultures within those contexts, or whether they were ultimately being emasculated and suppressed and leading towards ultimate Russification. And the way that people think about the Soviet Union today also embodies this kind of contradictory thinking, that is thinking about Soviet times and their impact on Central Asia. On the one hand, suggesting that Central Asians really are intensely traditional, and it's quite natural that they would emerge with new revival of Islam, for example, and potential radicalism and so on. But at the same time, the notion that they were so dramatically transformed by the Soviet experience that they've lost their soul, in a sense, that they no longer retain the connection with their traditional cultures. These kinds of discourses appear both in local discourses as well as in Western discourses about the region. Another interesting figure among those who studied Central Asia is this gentleman, Lawrence Crater, who is also an American. And he, just around the time of World War II, actually got some contracts with U.S. intelligence. He wrote a book called The Kazakhs, a manual for psychological warfare, for example, which were aimed at telling the American policy establishment and military planners and so on what they need to know about the region in order, in case we need to fight a war in that territory. And this became one of the dominant modes for thinking about Central Asia. I mean, the extent to which Central Asia and the Caucasus posed a threat to the stability of the Soviet regime, what we would need to know in order to support potential opposition to the Soviet regime through this region and so on. It's a bit ironic, though, because Crater himself was a Marxist, and most of the work that he was most proud of is reinterpreting Marx. And for example, the Oriental mode of production was one of the themes that he developed. And he eventually emigrated from the United States and went to live in Berlin because he didn't like America. I guess he had bad experiences with his military contracts in earlier years. He occupies an interesting place on the one hand, sort of knowing your enemy, but at the same time being more aligned with perhaps the Anna Louise Strongs of the world and Langston Hughes. Okay. Now, Crater, and especially the next people that I'm going to refer to, are the people that dominated the field of Central Asian studies when I began studying the region. And there really were very few people that studied Central Asia before the period of perestroika. In fact, when I started on my plan to be an anthropologist working in Central Asia, people told me, well, that's all very good, but you can't write a dissertation in anthropology based on library work. And the idea that I would actually be able to do field work in Central Asia seemed completely unthinkable at the time. I don't know why I thought I would be able to. It seems like crazy youth to me when I think back on it. But at that time, there were a few scholars who focused on Central Asia, and they occupied a number of the important universities. Edward Allworth here was at Columbia University and is still living in New York, and I guess there was a conference in his honor last year, I believe. Still has a gathering of his students could be brought together and so on. He was one of the important figures who I came to meet just when I first started out. And he's actually one of the very few who is a Native American, born in America. That is, most of the scholars who dominated the field at the time when I began were emigre scholars from one or another country, and I'll present a few of those people to you in a moment. But it's interesting how the field was dominated by such figures. And in addition to being emigres, they were also very sort of disparate in their positions. They tended to dismiss one another as authorities. They sort of had the problem of a small field where everybody wants to be the main figure in it. And so most of what the people that I'll present to you now, most of them, if you talk to them about the other ones, they would say, well, they're not doing very good work. And it really made a bad situation for studying Central Asia when I first started out, because not only were there very few people that you could turn to, but if you turned to one, then it meant that you couldn't really talk to the others very readily. And this, even within universities, it created problems because you tried to compose your PhD committee, and this guy is not going to let you pass if that guy likes what you're doing. But one thing that's really good about Central Asian studies today is that that's not true anymore. It's really changed, a very dramatic change. Another of the figures in this picture is Ilse Sertatus, who was, I think, quite instrumental in establishing Central Asian studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. She also is an emigre of German background, and she's fiercely anti-Soviet, very, very strongly aligned with the Central Asian peoples, and considers everything that all the influence of the Soviet period to be very bad for Central Asians, undermining their culture, and so on. And that's a thread that runs through a number of the people that dominated the field when I began. So there was a very strong sort of Cold War tinge to the study of Central Asia when I first started studying Central Asia. Another emigre scholar, Dennis Sinor, who was, I guess, the teacher of one of the participants here, he didn't really study the western part of Central Asia, that is the western Turkestan, the former Soviet republics, particularly. He was Hungarian by background. He actually just died a few months ago, living to a very good old age. And he, at the University of Indiana, so perhaps an unlikely place for being the hotbed of Central Asian studies, he established really the strongest program for most of the late Soviet period and perhaps even till today, one of the strongest programs for the study of this region. He, like other Hungarians, was interested in Central Asia and other things like Manchus and Mongols and so on, because of this idea of the commonality of the Ural-Altaic linguistic family. I'm not a linguist, but I actually don't believe the theory of unity. It seems to me, and those more authoritative people that I've talked to about this question, it seems to us that this is really more of a product of sort of a romantic imagination that wants to connect people across a very broad region, often rather in opposition to other people. So one of the utilities of the Ural-Altaic theory is that it creates a category which is posed against the Russians, right? It's the category that surrounds the Russians on all sides, and somehow can create a sense of unity among them. Of course, that idea has motivated certain efforts to actually create some kind of unity at various times. It works much better in the framework of Turkic unity, but even that has been relatively weak. So Turkey, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, tried to have greater influence in Central Asia on the basis of the concept of Turkic unity, but many Central Asians of Turkic linguistic background didn't really want a new older brother to take the place of the Russians once the Soviet Union had broken up. So those who want to unify often run into the problem that people don't want to be unified on the basis that they're being suggested that they should unify. For Sino, this wasn't really so much of a political project, but it certainly was an academic empire-building project. He's the one who devised the term Eurasia, and that was meant to be a geographic term that encompassed this kind of cultural unity. Also in Indiana, you have Yuri Bregel. He's actually now retired and living in Cambridge, so my neighbor. He came rather later to Indiana, but as Sino grew older, Bregel began to assume the prominent role. He is originally from the Soviet Union. He spent 5 years in the Gulag for telling a bad joke, an unfortunate joke, maybe a very good joke. Being turned in by another scholar. So there's very bitter stories in Central Asian field. Perhaps part of this connects with some of the reasons why people don't recognize or appreciate one another in the field to some extent. Bregel, like Steinor and Allworth, and indeed Sertatus, all of these people represent what I would call a rather philological, historically oriented kind of scholarship. And this is rather in contrast to, for example, Alexander Bennigsen, who I mentioned earlier, which was very much more focused on politics and the potential threats to the Soviet state and so on. But all of these scholars were working in a context in which, in order to sell your product, you really had to say that this is useful for security reasons and to make it relevant for the project of the Cold War. And many of these scholars' students did go on to work in government and other activities related to specifically matters that involved the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, or the West more generally. And of course, this forms part of the background for why you have some degree of, or in some cases, a very strong degree of anti-Soviet character within the field of Central Asian studies. Of course, add to that the bitter experience of people like Yuri Bregel, who actually spent time in a camp. And he was able to emigrate as a Jew, originally emigrating to Israel and then making his way to the United States. But all of these scholars have tended, on the one hand, to try to sell their expertise as relevant for policy, but really encourage their students to do philological, historical work. And there's a real divide between that generation of scholarship and what has emerged more recently of people working in social sciences or humanities fields, which are much more integrated into broader fields of scholarship, not so much concentrated on issues of relevance to security matters in many cases, although, of course, many political analysts are still very much concerned with that. When I first came to Harvard, there were several of similar figures. Joseph Fletcher had just died before I got there, who would have been probably one of the most prominent people in the field altogether had he not died very young. Omilyan Pritsak was my teacher of Kyrgyz. It was wonderful to have him as a teacher of Kyrgyz because he doesn't speak Kyrgyz. And he speaks English with a wonderful Ukrainian accent. But he told me stories about, for example, how he went to Turkological conferences where there was a Turkmen linguist speaking about how the progressive influence of Russian on the Turkmen language resulted in Turkmen pronunciation of Russian terms being exactly as that should be in Russian. But every example that he gave was a contradiction to his very point, according to Pritsak. So these discourses that intertwine the experience of studying language, which was when Pritsak was also a linguist and a philologist and historian, but also sort of this anti-Soviet project discourse. He eventually went on to study, to establish to lead the Institute of Oriental Studies in Ukraine after it became an independent country, before coming back to the United States, where he died. And another wild figure, I have to describe him as wild, another of my teachers, Richard Fry, who was an expert on Iran, but also Central Asia, wrote about Bukhara, early medieval times, but I think he actually worked in intelligence in the post-war period as well. I don't know that for a fact, but sort of these kind of mythical figures that occupied the field. We don't have so many mythical figures anymore. People have become more normal. But really a wild man. Whenever he gets up and talks, he's waving his arms around and talking about in very dramatic terms. So just to round out this picture of the development of Central Asian Studies, Central Eurasian Studies now, this is the CESS logo, the Central Eurasian Studies Society. What you see here is portraits of the current and last three presidents of the Central Eurasian Studies Society. So we have a much younger generation of scholars coming to dominate the field, and the older generation is really receding, and I don't want to minimize their importance or say that I don't appreciate what they've done, but the field has really changed a lot since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now characterized by such figures as this is Scott Levi, who was just elected the president. He's a historian of Central Asia, writing about its connections with India, and currently writing something on the Kokhan Khanate, so pre-contemporary. Yeah. And Marion Camp, who wrote about the early, or writes about the early Soviet period and does oral history work. And you see Jim Millward playing a Uyghur instrument. He's a specialist on China. And the field has become, as I mentioned, much less dominated by big personalities, but there's a lot more sort of broad cooperation. And what I think is most important is there's a strong sense that in order for Central Asian Studies to be relevant, it has to connect not just with sort of the narrow philological themes that unite philologists or some policy-relevant issue, but rather needs to be integrated with broader scholarship. And this is the big transformation that's been taking place in the last 15 or so years. That is, people who have done field work in the region and are trying to make that relevant to research questions that are pertinent to scholars in a much broader domain, and sort of maintaining a base within area studies like the Central Eurasian Studies Society enables, but at the same time entering into dialogue with disciplinary discussions that go much broader. I'm really out of time now, and this is a good place to stop. There are many interesting developments in the post-Soviet development of the field of Central Asian Studies, which we could perhaps come back to in the discussion. I'm sure that Gulnar and Rafis will also address in their presentation. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.